Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Happy to welcome another local person, Dr. David Williams, who's a fellow at St John's College and also a lecturer here in the veterinary school, the clinical veterinary medicine department, I should say, and also he's a lecturer in veterinary ophthalmology, and has also thought a lot about this whole question we're going to be tackling today on animal rights and human responsibilities. So thank you, David, and over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. They say, don't they, that you should never start a lecture with an apology, but actually I'm going to do two for you today. My kids realised that I've been talking 24 hours in the last 72, because I've been in Lisbon lecturing. They can't understand why people actually fly me somewhere and pay me to actually talk, and say, we pay you to shut up, Dad. But hopefully you won't feel that by the end of the day. But that's one apology, and the other one is that really, although we're talking about animal ethics and hopefully a biblical approach to that today, I'm not a trained ethicist. I have no qualification in theology. I'm not really qualified to unravel the biblical text for you. But I am a vet, and I suppose for the last 25 years I've been thinking through my approach as a Christian to my use and maybe others' abuse of animals. I had the joy of spending my 3 clinical years actually living at Tyndale House, so I had the opportunity to speak with many theologians there about this whole issue. So hopefully you'll see it's a work still in progress. I'd be really interested at the end, and maybe by email, and some of your comments and finding out where you're coming from as far as this whole area. Somewhere, oh yes, there's a little Grove booklet. I did produce a little Grove booklet called the same Animal Rights, Human Responsibilities that covers a fair bit of the material that I'm going to be looking at today. Those are on the bookstall, $3.50 if you're interested in taking that home and having a bit more of a look. It's quite easy. It's useful for group discussions as well. There are questions at the end of each and discussion points at the end of each chapter. Where should we start then? Well, Julie Andrews said we should start at the very beginning, didn't we? So when we start with Genesis 1, obviously we should really start with Genesis 1. As I said, actually, before Genesis 1 even, I'll tell you, my interest, of course, as a vet, is that I work with everything from bulls to bulldogs to bullfrogs. So I'm interested over the species, about how we deal with each of these animals, from the problems of keeping animals for food, for the purpose of killing them. I don't know if you've ever thought of that, of keeping them like that, or keeping them for the purpose of making them look as we want them to look, not necessarily as is best for them. And then what we do with wild populations that, from an environmental point of view, we're obviously going to have a big impact on them as well. But let me start then with Genesis 1. God creates a wonderful world full of amazing animals. He creates us at the same time. And he gives us the permission, the task of having dominion over his wonderful creation. Here's a picture by Lucas Cranach in 1520, showing Eden with Adam and Eve and God all walking together in the garden. But as you can see from some of the little side shows there, all too quickly that piece is shattered. All too quickly, dominion becomes domination. And interestingly, here's another picture, just a couple of years later, by Cranach, the same artist, showing Frederick III, Frederick the Wise, so-called, one of his stag hunting parties. And look at the difference there between the peace and togetherness, as it were, of Eden, and then the panic and the terror and the untogetherness, if you might say, of that hunting party. And of course, Cranach was the guy who we know his famous picture of Luther. Interestingly, here's his signature a dragon holding a ring. I'm not quite sure what the link is there. But actually, what was Luther and the Reformers' approach to this problem of animal use? Did they see that antithetical approach of the joy and peace of Eden, and then the problems that we have, and they had then, of dealing with animals at that point? So the trouble is, you see, that that dominion that we were given turns into the domination that's seen in that picture of the stag hunt. Something that writers like Ian McHarg and Lynn White would say lies at the heart of the eco-destructive tendencies of the last 50, 100 years. But maybe we shouldn't start at the beginning. Maybe we should start at the end. What about the new heavens and the new earth that we are promised? So here's a picture of the peaceable kingdom. You'll probably know this one by Edward Hicks. He was a Quaker preacher and a farmer and an artist. This picture from 1834. And this he would see as what God has in mind for a time when those problems of our relationship with animals have been sorted out. A time, as Isaiah would say, when the lion can lie down with the lamb and the child can play at the entrance to the snake's lair. But maybe that's too idealistic for today, for dealing with the problems that we have today. Or is it that these images are ones that should be our focus as we think of how, as Christians, we deal with the animals around us? Peter, of course, would say in his second letter, he would say, if things are going to be changed, going to be destroyed like this, how are we going to live now looking forward to the new heavens and the new earth in the future? And Hicks would say that actually he was trying, all that Quaker movement in the States was trying to farm in a way that looked forward to that peaceable kingdom, to try and make the kingdom now as peaceable as possible in the future. But it's hardly like that today, is it? Oh, sorry. Let me go back to my mentor when I was a child, and what he would have to say, where we should look for our understanding of dealing with animals. Mark Ruston, the Reverend Mark Ruston, the Round Church, where Holly and I first met a fair few years ago. Or maybe I should go back just 10 years ago or so, when Mark Ashton at the Round Church at St Andrew the Great was my mentor. Both of them would say that the place to look when understanding what to do about life now is to Christ, and particularly Christ on the cross. Here's another picture by Cranach of Jesus blessing the children. Jesus with what David Shepherd would call a bias to the poor, Jesus with a bias to the weak. And maybe that's something we need to look at now, not with regard to children, but with regard to the animals, the weak. How can we best be interacting with them? How should Jesus and what he did have an impact on our lives and what we do today? But actually, let's jump right into the middle of Jesus' conversation with the Jews around him about the value that they place on things. I couldn't find a painting, so you have to deal with real live birds here. You know, 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies. Yet not one of them forgotten by God. I think that's one. When I am dealing with the animals that I deal with every day, I just think that really empowers me for the work that I'm doing as a vet. That actually those individual sparrows are not forgotten by God, and yet the very hairs on our head are numbered. We're worth more than many sparrows. And it's that tension that I think is a big problem in trying to work out how we work as Christians with animals. Not one sparrow in Luke's Gospel, that's from Matthew. In Luke, not one sparrow falls to the ground, or maybe we should say is taken up into a cage. That's Professor Balcon's translation would be that, without God being concerned about it. But we're worth more than many sparrows. So the same could be said, of course, of the sheep pulled out of the ditch on a Sabbath. Animals created and loved by God, but human beings created, loved, and valued more by God, potentially. Well, we've leapt to the middle of Jesus' ministry, haven't we? What about the very beginning of it? It started with Jesus taken into the wilderness, where he interacts with the wild animals there. What the Jews at the time would have seen as dangerous, the opposite of what you wanted to be with, wild animals as far from humans as they could possibly make them. And yet here's a picture by Romero showing Jesus with those wild animals in the wilderness. What about the end of Jesus' ministry on earth? Here's De Bono's painting of Jesus riding into Jerusalem on that Palm Sunday. What? On an unridden colt, on an animal that had never been ridden before. Honestly, guys, I tell you, I mean, I'm a vet, but horses are not really my thing. I'm a bit nervous being on the back of an old nag who's never thrown anybody off in their life. But Jesus is there on an animal that's never been ridden before. And that's Jesus showing us how we should be, how our interaction with animals should be, as a controller of them, but a controller that also sees the needs and the values of the animal. And maybe that's what the cult was there for in the first place, for the use of Jesus riding into Jerusalem like that. And again, Richard Balcon has really, in his chapter in a book called Animals on the Agenda, really highlighted for me the animals in the wilderness, and then the donkey, the colt at the end of Jesus' ministry on earth. So it's very useful, his interaction. For one of the very few theologians who's really thought through animals and their use in the New Testament. But, of course, that's all lovely and gentle and calm, isn't it? That isn't what happens today. Whether it's the cows slaughtered and burnt 10 years ago, this month actually, starting with foot and mouth, or whether it's broiler hens kept in high concentrations. I think there's a very good system here, but actually some much worse than that, kept for our food. Billions of animals a year kept in those situations. This is I was asked whether I was going to show any eyes, because eyes is obviously what I do. I'll only show you one little picture. But this poor little dog here, kept to look bred to look neotenous, look as much like a little baby as it can, but with huge problems because its eyes just don't fit in its head. How can we have gone that far with pedigree dogs like that, or experimental animals, and this little nude mouse with an ear being fashioned on its back, obviously is a particularly emotive image of the problems that we have dealing with laboratory animals. So we have little rats kept simply in ventilated individual cages because the hygiene standards are better met in that sort of environment, and the quality of the science is said to be higher. Labour costs are reduced in that situation, but that rat is used to living in community with other animals. What are we doing to it by keeping it on its own without actually the ability to even have a smell communication, as it were, with the animals around it? This isn't how it should be, is it? It goes back to the single sparrow in Jesus' mind and the care that God places on that, and the single rat in the cage. We can't use animals just as a commodity, although of course by law an animal is owned by somebody, and they can basically, from that common law perspective, do what they like with it. We're very good in this country, obviously. We've got a great animal welfare law system, certainly as far as laboratory animals are concerned, and pet animals, and to some degree farmed animals as well. So we should keep animals with their needs foremost. But if you look at it, all my 3 sons and myself have needed hospital treatment that has depended on animals being used in laboratories to develop new techniques and new drugs. So they have a right to have a life that's acceptable to them, as we have a right to be able to have medication to keep us alive and well. How can we have that? How can we see through Scripture that tension of care for the animals and yet use of the animals for our benefit as well? If we go back to Genesis 1, there are those words, dominion, rule, subdue, that seem very, very harsh. So I was going to have the little Hebrew word down here, but the computer didn't let my Hebrew script, and actually it would be suggesting that I was fluent in Hebrew, which isn't true at all. So the computer also was telling me basically, don't lie to these people and suggest that you understand Hebrew well. So maybe it was just as well that it wouldn't work. So, but the interesting thing is rada, which is rule over. Actually, the root, ironically, of that is the part of the stem that holds everything together, holds the root underneath and the leaves at the top. So if we saw our rule as holding everything together, it's only while actually doing some research for this talk that I looked further into that and saw that isn't that a wonderful view. If we could be seen as holding together the animate creation and more than that around us, and then kabash is used of kings subduing a conquered tribe. Or even rape in Esther. But of course you've got to see the words in the context that they're being used. What's the context? The context is a garden with us as the gardener. Okay? And of course us, here's an image of Sargon III. Okay? And Sargon III looked over his people. And they quaked in their boots, I'm sure, looking at him like that. But his image there was a reflection of how his rule was with them. Do you remember that amazing time when Saddam Hussein's huge statue was knocked down by the people, and they were all saying that his image has gone, that means his rule over us has gone. Of course, that's the diametric opposition. What I'm trying to say to you is that if we are seen as the image of God, of a glorious, kind creator God, then we should be having that approach to how we rule over his creation. The thing is that if we look back to ourselves in Eden, we see that garden where we were meant to be beneficial carers and tenders of the garden is one where, of course, we were vegetarian. how does that link in with our meat eating today? Vegetarian, but of course immediately after the fall, we find that God gives Adam and Eve skins, animal skins, to clothe themselves. Abel kept flocks. God saves the world he almost destroys through Noah. You're wonderful. There's a family actually working with the creation around them to save it. What a wonderful image that is. But the moment that they're back on dry land, the first thing Noah does is sacrifice the very animals, some of the very animals he saved. I mean, presumably, over those 40 days, some of the birds had replicated in the arks. There were a few more than he needed, more than the 2 he took on to start with. But I wonder if Noah saw the irony of having saved all these animals and then sacrificed them. But why was he sacrificing them? For thanks to God. So there, he wasn't doing it for his own, to have a quick bird burger, as it were, to celebrate having got through the flood. No, he was doing it with his eye on God. And maybe that's something for us to think about. If we're using animals, if we do it with our eye on God, their creator, maybe we'll be in a better situation than we are at the moment. Abraham, of course, is prepared to offer Isaac, his son, again with his eye on God. And of course there the ram is rather quaking in his boots, wondering what's going to happen to him, and ends up being in Isaac's place. Isn't that strange as well? The ram must be really important, and all those animals killed through the Jewish sacrificial system in the temple. They're very important. The very fact they can stand in a substitutionary position means they're very close to us. And yet the fact that they are killed means that they are not us. They are far from us. So the animals are very important, but not to the point of not being able to be used in that very obvious perspective of actually being killed for us. But of course, their care is of prime importance. Proverbs 12:10 tells us, "The righteous man cares for the needs of his animal." Interesting. I've been doing some work trying to look at the cattle in Jewish slaughterhouses. It's very difficult to get into to do some work in a Jewish slaughterhouse. And I was talking to some of the rabbis, and they went, "Good grief, your knowledge of the Old Testament is," because I was pumping out all these quotes sort of thing at them, and they said, "Good grief, your knowledge of the Old Testament seems to be as good as or better than our flock." And I was saying, well, basically, yes. I mean, let's face it, Jesus was a good Jewish boy, wasn't he? And so of course I need to look at the Old Testament, but I suppose through New Testament eyes. So that image of the animal, since in a substitutionary perspective, is really important. And actually, if you think about how the animal's use by man is seen as an image in the Old Testament, of course, you've got Psalm 23 as the shepherd being a great picture of how God is with us. So here's a 2nd century cave drawing of a shepherd, and here's some 21st century shepherds in Jerusalem. And interestingly, what Psalm 23 tells us about how the shepherd deals with, how God the shepherd deals with his flock, is very similar to what we'd like to say today with how the 5 freedoms from the Farm Animal Welfare Council. Let me just go through my translation of Psalm 23, if I can, showing you how it's a brilliant picture of what we see now as the importance of animal welfare in a farming perspective. The Lord is my shepherd, he'll meet all my freedoms, okay, all of them. He lets me rest in pastures with ample, nutritionally beneficial herbage. So that's certainly one, and probably rest as well, freedom from discomfort there, and probably natural behaviours as well from that perspective. He leads me by water that's both thirst quenching and calming for me. So that's certainly one and three, and well, all of them, I suppose, together. He restores my soul. He guides me in appropriate paths. So that's the expressing natural behaviours and freedom from discomfort there. Even at the point of slaughter, his rod and staff, which many would see as sort of agents of his dominion over me, even that rod and staff actually comfort me back to freedom from discomfort and fear and suffering. They stop any fearful responses I may have at the point of death. If we had that in our slaughterhouses, written up, Psalm 23, written up on the wall of slaughterhouses these days, I think that would be really, really beneficial for the animals that go through there. What about going on to the New Testament? And maybe the most famous verse in the Bible. What do you think the most famous verse in the Bible is? Here's Rubens and Nicodemus and Jesus together. And Jesus says, doesn't he, God so loved human beings that he sent his only son. Is that right? No, of course not. God so loved the world. It wasn't just us, it was the whole world. Now, of course, there will be people who say, by world, what he means is people. I'm not sure I can say that. The word, of course, the Greek word is cosmos. Now, I'm not going to do what Don Carson would call and have an exegetical fallacy in saying that cosmos for them then is the same as cosmos means for us now. But there's more, I would contend, to God so loved the world than just God so loved people. There's more to it than that. In fact, how is it that God's love for us, shown by sending Jesus and his death on the cross, how does that link in with the rest of the world? Well, let's move on to Paul in Romans 8. You're probably going to expect me to go to with creation groaning, waiting for the liberation of the sons of God. But actually, I'd like to go rather to Colossians 1. Do you remember that? Christ is the head of all things. Here's the east window of the round church, where I remember for many years sitting and looking at that, wondering why Jesus on the cross there was in his glory. And of course, that's the whole irony of the cross, isn't it? That is where Jesus was, in a way, in his glory. But that we're saying now that in Colossians, through him all things were created, tapanta, all things, and indeed more than that, through him God will reconcile all things, not just us, but everything we reconcile to God through Christ's death on the cross. In fact, I want to make a little point here that I think Mark Ashton and Mark Ruston may have been a bit narrow in their focus in saying that actually the most important thing about Christianity was us and our route to heaven, and of course other people that we were helping on the way. I may be being unfair to them, but I think there are lots of Christians around who say that actually us and our relationship with God is the key thing that's the centre of Christianity. Actually, I think we'll find that there's a lot more to do with the rest of God's amazing created world that links in with that. And Christ in Colossians reconciling everything to God is so important there. Because you see, Christianity isn't just going to heaven when we die, with heaven being a sort of collection of our disembodied souls, as it were. Apologies, as I say, if that's a bit of a caricature that position. But I think actually there's much more importance in the rest of God's creation. We haven't got very much further in working out what to do with the animals that we're dealing with here, have we? Let's look quickly at how some other people see we should deal with that. Here then is Aristotle, who has his scala natura, his scale of being with men at the with humans. I think we'd probably say man, actually, but with humans we'd say at the top, and then all the other animals down to invertebrates and coral and things like that, right at the bottom. And my worry is that people like Augustine and Aquinas after him. So Augustine saying we appreciate animals die in pain, but actually, if they haven't got a rational soul, then they're not linked to us by any community of law. So we can basically do what we want with them. Again, that may be a bit of a caricature, taking one phrase out of Augustine's work, but I think it's important to see how that coloured Christianity from then on in, really. Certainly the same thing with Aquinas, saying there's no sin in using a thing that it was meant for, and God designed animals for our use, so it's okay, fine, no problem, guys. We can cope with that. But of course, before Augustine, there were people like St. Basil, who says, isn't that wonderful? Let me read it. Go crazy. Enlarge with us a sense of fellowship with all living things, our brothers the animals, to whom you gave us the earth as their home, in common with us. They live not for us alone, but for themselves and for thee. And somehow we've forgotten in Christianity that nobody remembers old St. Basil, and everyone remembers Augustine, or old Basil. Or Chrysostom, who said, surely we should show kindness and gentleness to animals, chiefly because they're of the same origin as us. Actually, if we go forward, of course, we've got St. Francis of Assisi. Oh, sorry. Amazing how you only see the spelling mistakes when you actually put it up in there. So Francis, of course, with a C, and everyone thinks of him and the birds, but actually he was interested in weak beings generally, whether they were people or animals. Don't exclude God's creatures from the shelter of compassion and pity. Or people will do the same with their fellow men. Well, way on then to Descartes, and I much prefer Descartes in his native French, saying "Je pense donc, je suis," because that sounds a lot kinder and calmer than "cogito ergo sum," doesn't it? But actually, qu'est-ce que se passe avec les animaux qui ne pensent pas? If he says "I think, therefore I am"? What happens with animals that in his view don't think? And I tell you, you read some Descartes, and I think to the level that Descartes expected people to think. So actually, if animals don't think, they are not. I don't think, therefore I'm not. They aren't players in his ethical world, sort of thing. A major problem there. Go on to Jeremy Bentham, of course. Thankfully, we can't really ask Descartes face to face. We can go up to that corridor in UCL and ask Jeremy Bentham face to face. I gather that the face is actually the only bit of him that still is him. Apparently, the rest of him's all decayed away, but at least they managed to mummify his face and keep him there. And he said, of course, the question is not, as Descartes would have said, can they reason or can they speak? But of course, can they suffer? And he said, yes, of course they can suffer. So they have to be in that ethical equation. And of course, as a utilitarian, he would say that they have to link in with that utilitarian equation, as it were. Go on to Darwin, of course. And ironically, although the origin of species was the basis of so much biology, after that, his emotions of animals, you'd say that to people, and you go, what? No, Darwin's the origin of species, not the emotions of animals. But what a wonderful book, where he said, let's look and see what animals have emotionally, not just the other primates, but all across the animal kingdom, and see where there are links And of course, through evolution, he saw that there would be links from that perspective between us and other animals. Didn't work though, did it? Because of course there were then people like Morgan, Lloyd Morgan, who said rather the opposite. I have to read this out because it's I think it's a bit complicated. In no case, said Morgan, may we interpret an action as an outcome of the exercise of a higher psychological faculty if it can be interpreted as the outcome of an exercise of one which stands lower in the psychological scale. That is a bit, as you see, I'm not really a Descartesian, so a Cartesian thinker. That is a bit different. Basically he's saying, if I see an emotion of fear in an animal, but actually biochemically and physiologically I can explain that through the actions of, say, adrenal hormones, then I can do away with the emotional bit of it, because all I have to do is describe it in terms of its biochemistry and physiology. But of course that's crazy, because we don't do that with people. Maybe you'd have done that with babies years ago, but even now, any person is given the right to have the emotions dealt with. That Occam's razor for the ethologist, which was Morgan's canon, doesn't really work with people, does it? Pain is a nociceptive neural construct and a behavioural response as well. And so there are people who say, oh, just because the reptile, for instance, doesn't have a high enough behavioural centres, you can just deny it pain and call it just a physiological response. You can argue round and round in circles with that, as I do with some of the people who work in neurology at the vet school. But sorry, Palmer. But you can argue round and round in circles. We've got to get out of that somehow, haven't we? Let's go back to the early 1960s. Now, even as a young child, I clearly had an empathy with animals, even if they were stuffed lions on Midsummer Common. But at the same time, I wasn't really understanding much about the ethics of agricultural use of animals at this point. But here was Ruth Harrison. I'm sorry, we've got Animal Machines there, and the picture I managed to get of her off the internet makes her look rather machine-like, doesn't it? I'm sorry about that. But she really showed people there the huge problem of animal use back in the 1960s, and it carries on today. And very quickly, the Bramble Committee managed to come up with basically what ended up as the 5 freedoms we've dealt with earlier. Within 10 years, ethicists such as Peter Singer were coming up with his book Animal Liberation, again back to Bentham as a utilitarian, seeing that actually animals should have the same ethical weight as us in that utilitarian argument. All animals? The worm lying on the side of the road drying out, does that have the same ethical weight as I do? Well, of course, Peter Singer said, no. Let's make them animals who have a preference for life. Well, of course, that preference, that worm, if you're able to ask it, has a preference to not to be taken as I would and put on the wet grass verge rather than dying and by being dried out on the road. But that isn't, of course, quite what Peter Singer meant by his preference utilitarianism. He would say that all the animals that we're dealing with, the mammals, say, and some of the birds have the same ethical weight. Tom Reagan has the same problem. He's a deontologist, so he thinks it's absolutely wrong to do things to other animals, to use them. But again, he says any creature. No. Let's say those who are a subject of a life. I'll quote him again. An individual whose life is characterized by beliefs and desires, perceptions, memory, a sense of the future, an emotional life together with the feelings of pleasure and pain, welfare interests, desires and goals, a psychophysical entity over time, an individual welfare logically independent of their utility for others. It would have been a bit easier to say animals that are like man. But I mean, he wouldn't clearly say that. But as I say, the trouble is, it leaves lots of animals that I'd like to say, are created beings worthy in God's sight. It leaves them out in the cold, doesn't it? So I would say that as a created being, in the same way as I am, then I should care for that worm in a simple way of making sure that it doesn't die if I can get around it. But if I had a gastrointestinal worm, if I had Tinea saginata, say, in me, I wouldn't feel quite the same need to stop it from... Well, you laugh. Let me take you into the middle of... I was going to say... let me say that we've been very naughty to go all through this talk and not talk about Andrew Lindsay, who's done some great work on this whole aspect of how to view animals through work such as the animal gospel and animal theology. He would say that God has rights in his creation, and spirit-filled breathing creatures, again we're getting to being a bit like man, aren't we? So the worm doesn't really count. Composed of flesh and blood, are subjects of inherent value to God, and thus the animals can make an objective moral claim, which is nothing less than God's claim on us. Again, I think it's better to say God just has a claim on us, saying you should care for those animals. The animals themselves, to my mind, don't have to have any rights, an unalienable right that I can't do anything with. But anyway, we might be able to discuss that a little bit more at the end. Let me take you into the middle of Africa, the Congo in 1914, and this amazing chap. He wears a bow tie, so he can't be all bad, can he? This is Albert Schweitzer, of course, with the reverence for life. But Albert, I mean, what an amazing chap. He becomes professor of theology and philosophy and an amazing organist. And then, age 25, says, I've done it all for myself. Let me give something back to God. Goes back to being a medical student, and then gets sent by, eventually managed to find a charity to send him out to Africa to work for the people there. But more than just working for the people, of course, an animal that came into his hospital would be cared for as well. But what about the trypanosomes that were giving sleeping sickness, that were killing thousands of people that he saw in his catchment area of his hospital, which was pretty huge? He said, as I look down the microscope and see these, and that I'm going to kill with the medication I'm giving to the people, how can I do that? If I've got a reverence for life, surely the trypanosome has life, as does the person. When he said the key thing to realise is that it's a necessary evil to kill those little parasites, to save the people from death. So I think that's really important to see that actually he saw the parasites as being created, and it was unfortunate to have to kill them, but it was a necessary evil. As far as eating meat was concerned, over his time in Africa, Schweitzer saw that it was actually an unnecessary evil to have to kill animals to eat, and so over time he became a vegetarian. But of course, he wasn't a tub-thumping individual who said you mustn't eat any meat. No, he said just that's a way of thinking. And of course, the Bible doesn't preclude meat eating. Noah's given permission to kill and eat the very animals that he saved. As I say, Jesus cooks fish for his disciples after the resurrection. And Peter's told by the Spirit to take and eat clean and unclean animals. Again, the tension there of the animals being created, but to be eaten as well. I guess a tension that won't be relieved until we get to the new heavens and the new earth. There we are all still groaning in the pangs of childbirth, as Paul would say in Romans 8. Let me just take you to Tom White. Have you read his Virtue Reborn? Let me just give you a little quote from him to just about finish with. The Bible opened with God assigning a particular vocation to human beings, that they should look after God's creation, make it fruitful and abundant. The Bible closes with a scene in which that has at last come about, only far more so. In the new heavens and the new earth, there'll be new vocations and new tasks, the ultimate fulfillment of those given to humans in the first place. Once we glimpse that, we'll be in a position to learn the language in the present, which will equip us to speak fluently in God's new world. So Wright is seeing the development of our character as looking forward to what it's going. He's not particularly looking at our use of animals, but I think it's really important to see that from that perspective. Shows that how we use animals here shouldn't necessarily be not to use them at all, but using them, looking to God and His final creation as it will be in the future. Raising animals for food. Yes, but where their welfare is actually really respected and the environmental impact of doing it dealt with at the same time. Keeping them for pets, for our benefit, but also not forgetting that they have needs and aspirations too. And so our place in the new creation won't be where we have nothing to do with animals, but rather where hopefully we can go back, or we can go forward, rather than going back to Eden, go forward to have the same interaction with them. So we have a major role now in fulfilling those responsibilities to mankind, to the environment and to animals, that hopefully will bring forward that relationship we shall have with creation, the new heavens and the new earth. But that is a very tall order to fulfill. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much, David. Well, over to you for questions and discussion, please. Who would like to be first? Please, thank you.
If you live with animals, I think you inevitably anthropomorphise them. But then an awful lot of people say you shouldn't anthropomorphise. If the animal shows affection, well, you know, you mustn't make them in your image. But isn't that the natural way when you see, as you said, the similarities? Okay, difference on a scale, but when an animal shows affection, it must be different, but it is part of the relationship.
Okay, what I would say is there's anthropomorphism, which is putting our characteristics on an animal. I had a wonderful programme on the radio about Johnny Morris. Do you remember Johnny Morris, the animal magic? And how basically the BBC dealt him a death blow when it was realised that she was far too that sort of anthropomorphism, when you're putting our characteristics on animals. And then zoomorphism, have you heard of that? Zoomorphism, which is when you're recognising similar attributes in an animal rather than putting ours. I mean, I'm not sure those are very, very different, but it's just a different mindset in seeing, yes, the animal is doing what I can recognise in myself rather than I can recognise in that animal. So do you see myself in the animal? Do you see? So I can recognise the animal in myself. And if you've got children, of course, my 3 boys, I can recognise the animal in them far more easily than I can recognise it myself. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that.
That was filmed.
Yes.
Please, yes. No, that's to you. Yes. Yeah.
Thinking of Descartes, there was a famous author, and I'm afraid I can't remember who it was, that said his dog constantly worries about whether he exists or not, whereas his cat doesn't worry about that at all because he knows that humans were made for his.
Well, ironically, I don't understand Descartes because actually Descartes had a dog called Mr. Crashy, Mr. Scratchit, who was always scratching. He clearly needed a vet. And so I don't understand how Descartes seemed to have two different minds. Had a mind that actually had a dog that he had as a companion, and yet, well, maybe, of course, he realised that dog didn't think in the same way as he did. So maybe he was able to say, the dog doesn't think as I do, but clearly that didn't mean that the dog had no place in his life. So, but yes, absolutely right. And maybe if Descartes had a cat, he would have had a completely different philosophical outlook, and the whole of the rest of philosophy would have changed. And interesting, I'll look into that in more detail.
Incidentally, there was a wonderful T-shirt that I saw that said, "I'm pink, therefore I'm spam."
I like that. That's very good.
Good, thank you. Right, please, yes.
You mentioned Jewish slaughtering, and there's also halal.
Yes, indeed.
I believe that it's been declared to cause suffering, and yet it's still legal in this country. Would you like to comment on that?
Right. Well, yes. So for various reasons, yes. I mean, there are a group in New Zealand, particularly, who have been very vocal in their research that show that actually if you put electrodes on an anaesthetised sheep's head and then cut its throat, it has a huge barrage of electrical activity that they suggest is suffering. But my concern is if you go into a normal abattoir and you see, okay, by stunning the animal, you're not having it suffering as you're cutting its throat. But the reason I want to get into a Jewish abattoir is that my feeling is everything is done slower. If you are saying a prayer before you slaughter the animal, I just wonder whether actually everything is done at a slower, calmer pace than the normal abattoir, where you're trying to put through an animal a minute, without actually. I'm sorry, this is only the abattoirs that I've seen, bothering too much about that animal's welfare. I mean, it's very difficult to know. And as I say, I'm trying to get into a Jewish abattoir to actually see that and be able to work out what's going on myself. But they're proving rather difficult to do that. And the only animal I've seen slaughtered in that way was a goat in the middle of the countryside in Israel, and it's only n equals 1, so this is hopeless. But the animal fell to the floor and died without uttering without any behavioural signs that it was in discomfort. But as I say, that's n equals 1 in a non-abattoir situation. But that's why I'm without seeing it for myself, I wouldn't want really to comment which way that's. And let's face it, the whole point of the cutting the throat to drain of blood was that Noah was told you can kill animals, but don't eat the blood, don't eat the life that's in it. Which from Genesis 9 was more, well, who knows exactly what God was wanting Noah to take from his command, but it's potentially about the welfare of the animal, given how others in that area were killing animals, or even taking bits of meat off the animal and keeping it alive. So potentially that Genesis 9 command was as much about animal welfare as about preserving a Jewish identity in meat eating.
Any other points? Any other questions people have? We've got time for one or two more. So, please, yes.
Could you work on DNA? Just put it perspective on the animal world, because we're all DNA derived, aren't we? Does that
Yeah.
change the argument at all?
That's right. Well, certainly. I mean, I just wonder that people might say that obviously understanding at a deeper level the similarities at the DNA and a biochemical level, but actually, well, as you said, people who live with animals actually just know. But Pat Bateson, in his brilliant evaluation of pedigree dog welfare, in one of the chapters says some people know what it is to be a dog. And there were lots of people who went, this is outrageous. That's not science, you can't know. And yet that's true. If you've lived with dogs for years, then you do have an understanding of how they interact with the world. And so similarly, the worrying thing about a farm that has 150,000 chickens on it is that you can't know how those individual chickens, if you have 5 chickens in a coop in your back garden, you know those animals really well, and that's a big problem with the huge farming facilities that we have now. And that's my worry about Nocton dairies in Lincolnshire. We're going to have a 7,000 head dairy farm. Actually, from an environmental perspective, they now stopped saying they'll do that. Actually, they were going to have a vet. I like this. They were going to have a vet there all the time, looking at the animals. Those animals, because of all the problems, were going to be in a phenomenal welfare situation. But actually, the individual cowhands would know them as number 40753A or something, rather than as Bessie or Daisy. And I remember as a vet student going to farms where the farmer knew each individual cow, which seemed to be better from a cow's welfare perspective. Although you can still have farms where the farmer doesn't know each individual cow, but still has an empathy with the animals that is all important. And the worry is losing that. I tell you, in a laboratory, go to a laboratory and the scientist who comes in won't know one rat from another, apart from that it's got a cage with a blue label that means it's the control animal rather than with the drug. But actually talk to the technicians who deal with those animals every day, and they know those, even if it's amazing, even if they're dealing with hundreds, I'm not sure about that. Even if you're a technician dealing with hundreds of animals, you know those animals, you care for them. It would be hopeless as a technician to live a life where you just dealt with them as if they were baked bean cans, But so I'm happy with a lot of the research that goes on, because the technicians who are caring for the animals actually do have an empathy with them, and it would be wrong to have a technician dealing with the animals who had no empathy with them. So my kids never ask me a question these days, because they know if they do, they have to sit down for an hour or two to have the answers.
The thing is to talk to your cat or dog. They're very patient. So.
That's absolutely.
Last quick question. We're happy a bit
How
of a
far
quick
down
answer.
do you
Yes.
go? What
Yes.
about fish farming?
Right, well, have you read Victoria Braithwaite's book, Do Fish Feel Pain? And it could be a very short book, yes, but actually, so she's done a lot of work, and so I do feel from all sorts of perspectives there are problems with fish farming from the perspective of what happens when you put all those animals together from a health point of view. Actually dealing with them individually, they clearly haven't got the sort of the higher levels of cognitive awareness that a mammal has. But still, if you've kept goldfish, you know that when you lift the lid in the morning, they all go up for the food. So there's more to a goldfish than just, in the same way as there's more to it. Ask Nikki Clayton, the professor of comparative psychology here. She'll tell you there's more to a bird than being bird brain, sort of thing. And similarly, did you see Jenny Morton's paper a couple of days ago showing that sheep can have cognitive awareness, much more than we thought previously. Sorry, back to fish farming. I mean, the other problem with fish farming, of course, is that what you're putting into the fish farm then it goes out in the runoff and may have environmental consequences. But would you prefer to farm a fish and to be able to electrically stun and kill it just like that in a big tank, or to farm it to dredge it up in a trawl from the wild and have it die of asphyxiation on the top of a trawler? There were some lovely fish things out there. There's some lovely food out there, including the fish fingers. It's only after something like this I think, gosh, should I have become much more vegetarian. I'm not completely vegetarian because I mean in Histon, anyone from Histon here? But so if you go to David to the butcher in Histon, you can be sure that the animals coming from there are coming from welfare-friendly farms. And if I were to stop eating them altogether, then I'd stop giving a benefit to those welfare-friendly farmers. So I do still eat, but I'm much more careful about the welfare implications of what I eat now. As I say in one point in this little book. Last plug, and then I'll stop. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, indeed, very stimulating talk. Thank you so much.